Several people have asked me about my view over the years on the whole kind of lesbian and gay Christian movement, what I think the Bible says about that, what 2003 it became a big issue because there was a bishop appointed who was a gay man in Reading. He was then not appointed to be a bishop because they thought that was wrong, so they sent him somewhere else, and I think he became a canon or a dean, which was quite strange, I have to say. And if he's not good enough to be one, then surely he shouldn't be the other. So that was a complete nonsense, I thought, but there you go. And then in America they appointed a gay bishop called Gene Robinson. If you ever watched Gene Robinson on anything, he is just an amazing godly man. So he's well worth a little look on YouTube. And anyone who wants any of these names, books, or anything later, just come and ask me. So that was about 10, 12 years ago. That was the big issue then. And then I guess it's come up again over the last year or so because of gay marriage and the church thinking, well, what on earth do we do about this one now? Because we thought this had kind of rumbled and ground to a halt, but it's still going. So what do we do now? Because actually it might come to a church near you at some point soon, because someone might say to a church minister or vicar, when they come in, would you, the same-sex couple, come in and say, would you marry us? And then what does the church do in that situation? And I think actually we should, at least as a church, talk about it like grown-ups, because this is not a discussion that you would often have in church on a Sunday morning. And people might say to me, well, you shouldn't do it on a Sunday. You can talk about it on another day, but don't talk about it on a Sunday morning because it's not appropriate. Well, in for a penny. That's what I thought. So that's what I'm thinking about this morning. I want to just recommend a book to you, because if you'd like to just read it a little bit more, and I say a little bit more because it's a tiny book. This cost me £1.55 on Amazon this week. It's used. There's lots of copies of this around, used for £1 or so. This is by the aforementioned man who is not the Bishop of Reading, but it's called Geoffrey John. This is his book, and it's called Permanent, Faithful, Stable. It is 60 pages long. It's tiny, and this is basically about what the Bible says, in his view, about Christian same-sex partnerships. Really, really good little book. Cannot commend this book highly enough. I'm not going to lend it to you. The reason I'm not going to lend it to you is because this is my 4th copy of this book. Because someone in here has stolen the other 3. So anyway, who knows? Who's got a good friend who is gay or lesbian? Anyone got a good friend? Trusted friend. Who's got a friend who's a gay Christian? Okay, quite a few. Okay. Now, about 10 days ago, I watched a horrendous program on TV, and this is still on iPlayer. It was on BBC, and if you want to watch it. It was heartbreaking. It was called something like the worst place in the world to be disabled. It was a shocking program. Did anyone see it? It was about Ghana. It was dreadful, absolutely dreadful. The 2 things that I thought were really sad, or the 2 people, was one guy who I think I can't remember which person was which. I think this guy was unable to walk, and he had been in his room for 15 years. And he'd just been in this fairly dark, dingy room for 15 years. And the only people who went to see him were kind of his family, and that was it. No one really went to see him, but he'd been in there for 15 years. And his life was just a complete tragic mess. I mean, the room that he was in was not as big as our reception area there, and it was dull and dingy, and he'd been in there for 15 years. And the other one that really struck me was a guy who had mental illness, and what they had done with him, because he was mentally ill and they didn't know quite, it was, he said he wasn't, they said he was, and what they had done, they had chained his ankle with a metal chain to a post, and he lived his life, this guy, in a room chained to a post. It was the most appalling program I have ever seen. It was heartbreaking. I know people who have disability who are church ministers who watched that and were just absolutely devastated by watching it. It was tragic. It's on iPlayer. Watch it if you want to. The reason I bring that program up was because those 2 people, and generally the reason that they were treated like that was because in the Ghanaian faith in a certain flavour of Ghanaian Christianity. The reason that they done that was because they thought that those people were cursed by God, and they would hide them away rather than let them be seen. And what they do in Ghana, and people get paid to do this, is if they have a child with a disability, a very small child, they will poison them and throw them in the river. And because it shows the sin of the parents, and it shows the curse of God that this child could be born with a disability. It's a shameful thing. So they will pay people, and imagine that as a job. The person's job will be to poison a baby or an infant and chuck them in the river, and that because the parents don't want to do it, but they'll pay someone else to do it, and it will be done in the sight of the road. And that's common. And it's a biblical teaching that has given permission to act in that way. And that's why I think the Christian attitude towards the gay and lesbian community is very, very important, because it will be our attitudes and our faith that will metaphorically tie people to a post with a chain, or give us permission to chuck them in the river. And with all the goodwill in the world, and the people in Ghana who are doing this because they are Christians are doing it out of what they believe is the righteousness of God and the right thing to do. They are not doing it because they're evil people. They're doing it because of their faith and spirituality, which has given them permission to do it. And our faith and spirituality must not give us permission to dehumanize people, whatever. And that's why I'm passionate about this, because it's not even maybe this issue. It's about how we treat people. It's about how we read the Bible. It's about how our faith gives us permission to respond to others. When I first became a minister in training, what they did at the time, and I don't think they do it anymore, they used to give you a form, and it was called the MR1. And they'd plonk this form in front of you, and you had to sign this. This was the do not pass go, do not collect £200. If you don't sign this form, you don't go to college, you don't get on the training, you don't get accredited, and nothing happens. And on the form, it doesn't say much about beliefs, because really you can believe anything you like. I mean, doctrines-wise, who cares, really? But on the MR1 form, what you have to sign is that you're not going to promote same-sex relationships. If you don't sign that, you can't go and get trained. So anyway, I had great issues signing that form, not because I was going to promote same-sex issues, but because I thought, what a bizarre thing to put on a form. Really? Of all the things I could think and believe, what a bizarre thing to put on this form. Name, yes. Address, yes. Do you believe? Same-sex, sign the form. So anyway, I had long conversations with one of my tutors. And she said, God bless her, she said, you know what, it's better to change an organisation from in it than without it. Just cross your fingers, she said. So I signed the form. It's hard to sign a form with all your fingers crossed, your legs crossed, your toes crossed. But I thought, I can't start training unless I sign this stupid form. This form is now gone, thank goodness for that. But it was a real difficulty, not because I believed it, not because I'd even made up my mind what I thought, but because I thought it was wrong, actually, to have to sign that to begin training. Because if you're going to learn stuff, it was a nonsense. It might change my mind about that if I'm learning about it. What a nonsense. Anyway, so I moved on a few years, and I came here, and what a lovely load of people. And there was a couple of people in the church at the time. Very funny day, actually. Looking back, it was fun. It wasn't funny at the time. They told me that unless I said to them, I would rather go to jail than perform a same-sex marriage, they were basically going to leave. And I thought, what a bizarre thing to leave a church for. I mean, it hasn't happened. This might never happen, unless you'd rather go to jail than... Really? Anyway, so that was a very rude afternoon, actually, but there you go. And anyway, a few months later, they'd left the church, but a few months later, Ali was born. My little son, Ali, he's now 7, a bit like me, talks a lot, and lovely little thing. So anyway, I'm holding Ali. Boy, how proud. Anyway, one of these people came up to me and they said, oh, you must be so proud. It's perfectly natural. I know. I was there at the time. I know how this happened. Isn't he cute? It's perfectly natural. What the hell are you talking about? And it didn't dawn on me till later. It's perfectly natural. He kept saying, it's perfectly natural. He had made the assumption that I was gay because I cared about the issue and wasn't going to be drawn on it or agree with it. And because in the Bible, his reading of it, it says that same-sex partnerships are unnatural. So the perfectly natural result of husband and wife was resting in my arms. It's perfectly natural, he kept saying to me. It was just bizarre. I wish I'd clocked it at the time. I didn't get it till later. I thought, what are you on about, man? Anyway, so I went off to a gay church in Bournemouth. That was quite interesting for a college placement. What a wonderful load of people. I have never seen more passionate, devoted Christian people than in that church. They're not all gay, but they kind of sympathise and believe in an inclusive church. They completely changed my theological view. But the thing that probably changed my view right at the beginning was well before I moved here, and this must have been about when I was about 28, 29, Claire and I can't be married long. I went along to a Guernsey Evangelical Alliance service. It's always a dangerous place to be for someone like me. And so I went along to this, and this young guy came in and sat with me, and his friend who'd bought him came in and sat with me. Now, you've got to think, at that point, I was like right-wing fundamentalist of Christianity, evangelical Christianity. I was as fundamental as you could possibly be. You wouldn't believe it now, but I was complete right-wing. And some. I had a very literal interpretation of the Bible, and so I sat there, and the minister that night was talking. It was a visiting speaker, so there was me, this young guy, and the friend of his who'd bought him, who I knew quite well. And she'd finally persuaded this young guy to come into the church. I'd never seen anyone with such low self-esteem in my life as this young guy who just didn't look up the whole time. And she'd managed to bring him in, and he was gay, and she'd brought him into the church that night. And we were told to bring people to church because it's good for you, and, hear about Jesus, and that's a good thing. And so, well done to her. She'd brought him in. Good. So he was sitting there. So the minister at the front was talking about his church. He was doing mission work, and his church was there, and they'd opened this church, and next door to it was a gay nightclub, and he said, right next to the work of God is the work of Satan. And then he talked a lot about Satan, and Satan was very cross, and God was very cross with Satan as well, apparently. And this poor young guy who was sitting next to me was just buckling in his seat. It was dreadful. It was dreadful what was happening. And I went into the church that night as a right-wing evangelical fundamentalist, and I came out of the church that night as something completely different. And then it took me about 15 to 20 years of very slowly and painfully unpicking a Christian faith, which was very fundamentally, and building up something new. And it was the most difficult and painful experience of my life, because I wondered if I believed any of it. And now, if you've ever wrestled with your faith, you will know how difficult that can be and how painful that can be. And that's what happened that evening, because I went out thinking, whatever has happened, this guy has been brought into this place and he's been made to feel even worse. And he's been treated appallingly tonight. I think what he's heard, if he was feeling like low self-esteem and like just rejected before, now he will feel even worse than he did before. And where's the good news in that? And then we started the journey. So when I went to college, I wrote my dissertation on the whole issue of this. And if you want my dissertation, you are welcome to text me or email me and tell me you'd like it. It's on my computer. You can read it. Don't read all of it. You will be bored stupid. But you can read the bit about the biblical texts. That's quite interesting. And you can read the bit about the history of attitudes towards homosexuality and lesbianism. And you might be interested in that as well. And you might not be interested in any of it. And you might think it's complete rubbish. But I've read everything that has been written about it, that it is credible and respected. So although I may be wrong on this issue, I am not ill-informed and I do know what I'm talking about. Doesn't mean I'm right. Just means that I care a lot and I've read a lot. And I think this is really, really important for the church. Not just our church, but the church. So I'm going to look at three things today. Firstly, very quickly, I'm going to give a whiz through 2,000 years of attitudes and a few little dates. Second thing I'm going to do is look at the the biblical texts quite briefly, and the third thing I'm going to look at is, I guess, in the context of marriage, and what do the Bible texts and what does this lot mean for us today. So I'm going to do three things, and from now I'll probably be about 25 minutes, half an hour. I'm looking at the clock, aiming to finish by past. I'm not doing questions because we will just be here for hours. We'll be here for hours. And you want your lunch, and I want my lunch. But I am happy to talk to you about this at any time, and you can come in and get a coffee with me. In groups, if you want to. I don't mind how you want to do it. Okay. History. Now, the early church didn't really major on this at all. There were issues that they did major on. This wasn't one of them. The first time it really kind of came into writings and get a mention was in the Epistle of St. Barnabas, and this was about 70 to 135 AD, so it's 100 years probably after Jesus, well, by the time Barnabas died, and presumably he didn't write this when he was a young child, so this was probably about 100 years-ish after Jesus. And what he did, he condemned this thing called pederasty, which is something that we would condemn now as well. Because what they would do in Jewish culture at the time, when you watch like Jane Austen films, you will see the young ladies who are brought into society by another woman, won't you? And they're kind of taken to the ball and they're kind of shown off and they're brought into those circles, those cultural circles where they'll find Mr. Right and all that kind of thing. And they move from like being a girl to a young lady to a young woman who's there to be kind of paraded, presented, and brought into those social circles. Pederasty was kind of the same, but the other way around, in that it was men who would bring young men into Jewish culture. So they would mentor them and train them. They would teach them what it was like to be a Jewish gentleman, and then they would bring them up and they would introduce them. They'd take them to parties and whatever. And pederasty was that. But when it took a dark and sinister turn, it took on kind of elements of sexual abuse, and the older mentor was doing things that were inappropriate with the younger man. And that's the first time that this was kind of condemned, and that was in about 70 to 135 AD. In 390 AD, then you got a bit more stuff on it, and the emperors at the time decided that those people guilty of shameful sex should be put into the avenging flames in the sight of all the people. So anyone found guilty of same-sex relationships in about 390 would be taken out into the town square and burnt with everyone watching them. But that was about 300 years-ish after Jesus. Then you got this long period called Middle Ages. Same-sex intercourse is listed with kind of other sins. The big problem that they had with same-sex was that it was prevalent amongst the clergy. So in their wisdom, they decided that the best way they could deal with this was to take all the clergy who were having same-sex intercourse and put them in monasteries together. Can you spot the flaw in that rather brilliant plan? So anyway, that didn't work terribly well. And along came someone called Thomas Aquinas. And you might not know about Thomas Aquinas, but he's influenced your faith because there's a few people who have, and Thomas Aquinas was one of them. Thomas Aquinas, 1225, 1274, he elevated homosexuality or same-sex intercourse, because it wasn't known as homosexuality then, he elevated that as a sin because it was contrary to the proper end of the sex act. Meaning, you couldn't have babies. And if you can't have babies, it's not legitimate sex. And Thomas Aquinas has influenced large wings of the church, even now, about birth control, which is unnatural sex, because it's contrary to the proper end of the sex act. That's what Thomas Aquinas was on about. He was on about same-sex relationships, but he was also on about birth control. Because it was not right, because at the end of it you should be able to produce a baby. And if you couldn't, it was wrong. It was just lustful and dreadful, and you shouldn't get involved in that at all. So from 1225 to 1274, the church took a much different stance on it, whereas before it had kind of been just, it's one of those things. Now they started to excommunicate people who were caught in same-sex relationships, and they would not let them into some churches. So that was kind of the way it went from about 1225. That's about, 1200 years after Jesus. And then in 1533, Henry VIII decided to introduce the death penalty for all people who were guilty of same-sex intercourse. And that then remained until 1861, and the last recorded execution was in Paris in 1750. But if you look on the internet and look up homosexuals in Iraq and Afghanistan and whatever, and that area of the world, you will see photos today of young men hanging up from trees and all kinds of stuff, because that was the last recorded execution in Paris, but it still happens today. Why? Because of people's strong faith. That's why it's important. Isn't it ironic that Henry VIII, of all people, decided that actually people guilty of same-sex intercourse should be executed? Isn't that unbelievable? How does it go? Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. And yet, it was Henry VIII who decided that this was a good idea. What a nonsense. Now, in 1869, there was a writer, and he was called Carl Maria Kirkbenny, and that's 1830-ish years after Jesus. About 1800 years after the letters of Paul. And Carl Maria Kirkbenny said he used a new word. Oh, we've never heard that word before. He used a new word, and the word that he used was homosexual. It'd never been written before. So whatever it says in your Bibles, if it uses the word homosexual, it's very clever of them, because that word didn't exist till 1869. Just didn't exist. Now it can be something without being given a name, but what Kirkbenny did was different as well, because it wasn't just the word, but what Kirkbenny did also, he gave this an orientation. It's never had an orientation before. Until 1869, anyone who was involved in a same-sex relationship was viewed universally and by everybody else as a heterosexual person who was acting up. Until 1869. So, anyone who was having sex with someone of the same gender was seen as like a person who was straight, who was then going for some extracurricular activity somewhere. And actually, most of these people were married, and so actually they were a man married to a woman going off with another man, because they didn't have any language or concept that being gay or lesbian was a different orientation. Neither did Paul. Neither did they in Leviticus or in Rome or Corinth. They had no language for that at all. Homosexuality decriminalised in 1967, 1966, and 1967-68. The Anglican Church voted for decriminalisation. The year after, the Methodist Church voted for it as well. Interestingly, when the Anglican Church voted on it, less than half the people who were allowed to vote actually bothered to vote or decided to vote. Most of them didn't vote. So there you go. A brief history of homosexuality in the church and culture. If you want lots of books, I can give you lots of books. So that's what culture and the church says. What about the Bible? Now, I'm Christian minister. I'm a Christian. I like to read the Bible. I think the Bible needs to inform us, and I think we actually should take the Bible very seriously. So I want to take the Bible seriously in this matter, as every matter. And I think that this issue is much more than about homosexuals and lesbians. I think that this issue is about how we read the Bible. That's at the heart of the thing here. How we read the Bible. Because we need to either read it as words on a page, or we need to put it in a culture and understand what was going on at the time. Now, if you are where I was, on the far right and some, you will probably say, well, actually, the words are there. That's what God said on the matter. But actually, I think it's important to understand the culture and the context of what God and Jesus were saying. If Jesus had said anything about this at all, I think it's important to know what they said about it. Because if we take things out of context, we look like Egypt. Because didn't Jesus say that you can't follow him unless you hate your brother and your mother and your father? If you take that without, reading that into context, what a ludicrous thing to say. So actually we've got to understand what the Bible says and why and when and to who. So let's go through a few of these quite quickly. Bible passages. If you want to look them up, you can. They're not a secret. They've been in there for a long time. Okay, first one, Genesis 19, 1 to 25. If you know this story in 390 gave the emperors legitimate permission to burn people who were caught in same-sex relationships. This story. And what happens in Genesis 19? It's the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. There are some people there. They receive visitors. Now, in Jewish culture, it's very important that you welcome your visitors. Very important. So the two visitors came, and all of the men in the town, not just some, all of the men in the town, it says, came banging on the door, demanding that these two visitors be sent out of the house so that they could all gang rape them. Now, poor homeowner thinks, that's not very hospitable. Don't think it said that on TripAdvisor. So, we better not send them out. Here's a plan. Have my daughter. You can all gang rape her instead. What a shocker. So anyway, I think that God is probably as opposed now to what happened then as he was then, and I think God would be opposed to that forever. It's nothing to do with homosexuality. It says all of the men in the town came. Never in any town surely have all of the men in the town been gay. This is nothing to do with it. This is a story about inhospitality and gang rape. That needs to be stricken from the record, I think, in the debate. It's a nonsense to ever bring that up in a discussion about homosexuality. It's a nonsense. It's an offence that should get mentioned in that context. Actually, if you read Isaiah, God had already decided what to do with Sodom and Gomorrah, because he decided to do it about their pride before this happened. Don't read that text wrong. It's very important. Leviticus gets a bit more complicated. You know this one. You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. If a man lies with a male as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination, and they shall be put to death. Their blood is upon them. An abomination actually is a Jewish uncleanness, just so you know. We don't really. It's a good word, but we don't really know what it means nowadays. In fact, this is the only time it ever gets mentioned as an abomination. It's not in our language anymore, but lying with. In fact, what it translates as is this: you should not sleep the sleep of a woman with a man. That's what it says. Because it's an abomination. Eating pork is an abomination as well, by the way. Same thing, same word. But anyway, they said they should be taken out and put to death. Couple of things about this. Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20, both of those chapters are introduced about making the Jewish people distinctive from the Egyptians. Leviticus 20 is about people worshipping the god Molech. I think these chapters primarily are about Jewish distinctiveness. There's other things as well. But actually it's about the Jews being different from the Egyptians. They're out of Egypt and they are different to the Egyptians. And the Egyptians and the people in the Canaanite religion who worshipped Molech, which is what the Jews are called to be different to, the worshippers of Molech would have temple prostitution going on, and that was a big part of their faith, and they would have male and female prostitutes in their temples. And I'm not surprised that God said, actually, you are not to be like them. Because to be like them was endorsing ownership of a person, rape and prostitution. So I think the thing that God objected to then, he probably still objects to now. But I don't think it's the thing that we sometimes associate it with, because it wasn't about homosexual relationships. In the kingdoms of that time, Egypt, Assyria, Greece, Rome, Israel, sex had nothing to do with being equal partners either. Men were important, women were objects. And that's what it was like. And for a man to become an object, which is what this was calling them to do, it was placing them as less than they were worth. It was making them a nothing. And God, I think, was probably saying, I don't want you to be nothings. I want you to be distinctive from the Egyptians and the Canaanites and the Romans and all their temple prostitution and all of that nonsense. I don't want you having nothing to do with that. And also, I don't want this going on. And furthermore to that, at the time of this, what would have been quite common would have been if the army of Israel had gone face to face with the army of Canaan and Israel had won that battle, then their soldiers would probably have raped all the other men. And I think God was probably saying, do you know what? That is dehumanizing and that is disgusting. And I don't want you doing any of that. And I think God is opposed to what he was opposed to then, but I don't think he's talking about homosexual relationships. Not mutually loving homosexual relationships, which are between adults who both know what they're on. It's about humiliation. It's about holding power over another person and making them captive. And the other thing about the Leviticus passage is in Genesis, there's a really bizarre story in Genesis 38. And it's the story of Onan. And it's a bizarre story. Really bizarre story. Because Onan decides on his birth control method and withdraws and spills semen on the ground. And what do? They kill him. Why? Because in that time and place, you look shocked. Well, it says it in the Bible. You look shocked. In that time and place, they believed that the man held everything of life, and the women contributed nothing to life. The woman was an incubator, and what Onan had done was he had taken a life and spilled it on the ground. And what's worse, he'd done it in a time when the people of Israel had come out of Egypt and there wasn't many of them, and they were trying to build up the people and make sure that they were a strong and mighty people again, and he'd just gone and killed one of them by throwing it on the floor. And because of that, they stoned him. Poor Onan. Don't know what you think about Onan, but what a bizarre story. It was un-Jewish, and the Jews, when they were talking about all the other races, they used to say same-sex relationships. That's what those other people do. And they were trying to be distinctive and not abusive. And I can kind of understand why they thought it was important to build up the tribe and populate the planet, but there's about 7 billion of us now, and I don't think that's so much of an issue now as it was then. In fact, I think we could probably go quite the opposite. Jesus in the New Testament says nothing about it. If you want to look up the passages, Mark 7, he condemns sexual immorality. Matthew 19, he basically says, guys, if you cannot commit to marriage you need to be celibate. The only time that Jesus might have said anything about homosexuality, I think, is in Matthew 8. And it's also in Luke's Gospel as well. But Matthew 8 is the interesting one. Because in Matthew 8, you get the story of the centurion's servant. It's a fine little story, and we just read it and we think, oh, that's lovely, Jesus did a miracle. But a centurion having a servant is probably quite unlikely. And Matthew's Gospel is the closest to the original language, and Matthew's Gospel is written in kind of Jewish slang. And Luke's Gospel is not. Luke's Gospel, different language. Matthew just writes it in slang. Now, the word that is used for servant would be more likely to be used for young man, or would be more likely to be used as a term for lover, which is quite an interesting twist to that passage. Because actually, Jesus doesn't say anything about it at all. He just heals him. He commends him for his faith, because I think Jesus was much more interested in his faith than his sexuality. And he just heals him and he does his thing and off he goes. Do you know what? I suspect, and I might be wrong, but I suspect that one day, hopefully many years from now, when I roll over and die, and the same with all of you and the same with everyone, I suspect that the first question that comes from Jesus when he meets us is not going to be about our sexuality. I think it will probably be much more about what kind of person you are, what your faith was like. If his first priority is were you gay or lesbian, I think I've seriously misunderstood Jesus somewhere along the road. So anyway, and then we go to Romans, because Jesus didn't have a lot to say. Romans says this is a good one if you're standing out in the street with your megaphone. For this reason, God gave them up to degrading passions. Their women exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural. Oh, it's so natural. And in the same way also, the men giving up natural intercourse with women were consumed with passion for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men and received in their own persons the due penalty for their error. Pulpit thumping verse that is. Written to the Romans. Romans actually at the time had emperors for 200 years, all of whom their love had not been entirely correct. So it says, apart from Claudius. The rest of them were all married, but having a bit with other guys as well. So that was written to Rome, but it was written in Corinth. Paul wrote to the Romans from Corinth. Now, when he was in Corinth, the main thing about Corinth was that their worship of the goddess Aphrodite. Now, Aphrodite was a hermaphrodite, so she had male bits and female bits. And in their rituals, the people in Corinth believed that they needed to imitate the opposite gender having sex with temple prostitutes of the same sex. And that's where Paul was writing this thing. So he's writing to the Romans, whose emperors are not homosexual but have been having whatever, because they didn't know what homosexuality was, because it didn't say it till 1869, so they can't call them homosexual. They are straight people acting up. So he's writing to them from Corinth, where there's a temple with all sorts going on with prostitutes of here, there, and there. Now, when you read the words of Paul, do you think that Paul is talking about a loving, mutual, same-sex relationship, or do you think that Paul is writing about things that he sees? Because Paul writes about the armour of God. Now, Paul's seeing things. He's seeing Roman soldiers, and he's writing what he sees, and I think Paul is writing what he sees. Then it makes much more sense. There's two other texts in the New Testament. One's in Corinthians, one's in Timothy. These verses, for a start, the meanings of these verses are completely ambiguous. Amongst the Bible scholars, serious academic Bible scholars, most of them will say that they don't know what these mean. Different language, different place, different culture. But interestingly, especially in the Timothy one, it was about abuse and prostitution. Because what was going on at the time was the kidnap of handsome young boys to be abused in brothels or used as temple prostitutes. And that was the culture and the time. But it's generally recognised that these texts are ambiguous, and no one actually knows what the words really mean in them. So I think the Leviticus and the Romans ones are central. I think you need to bin Genesis, because I don't think that says anything about it at all. I don't think these say much. And I think that Romans and Leviticus, if we read the context, it's a completely different thing, and it doesn't have anything sensible to say to loving mutual homosexual relationships nowadays. One of the books that I read was by a guy called John Boswell. I'll read you this because it's quite small, because it's all on one slide. Boswell said this: "It is, moreover, quite clear that nothing in the Bible would have categorically precluded homosexual relations among early Christians. In spite of misleading English translations which may imply to the contrary, the word homosexual doesn't occur in the Bible. No extant Hebrew, Greek, Syriac or Aramaic contains such a word. In fact, some of these languages ever contained a word, in fact, none of these languages ever contained a word corresponding to the English word homosexual. Nor did any languages have such a term before the late 19th century. Neither Hebrew nor Aramaic has such a word today. There are, of course, ways to get around the specific word in a language, and an action may be condemned without being named, but it is doubtful in this particular case whether the concept of homosexual behaviour as a class or orientation existed at all." I think he's got it absolutely bang on, Mr. Boswell. Absolutely bang on. I think the Bible is condemning activities and behaviour which are more appropriate for people like me as heterosexual people to be warned about than the gay community. I don't think the Bible's got anything to say to the gay community in mutual, loving relationships as we might see them today. Interestingly, for us far-righters who were on the far right, maybe not now, Jesus didn't say anything about homosexuality, but he did say things about divorce. And the Bible says a lot more about divorce than it says about homosexuality, because it doesn't say anything about homosexuality. It might say things about same-sex, but it doesn't say anything about homosexuality per se. But it does talk about divorce. And I think if we take ancient texts, we are in serious danger of completely missing the point, because Jesus seems to condemn divorce. And do you know what I think is tragic about taking a literal stance on these texts? Is because for centuries, the words of Jesus have enabled women to be treated like property, and it has kept people in abusive relationships. And it has imprisoned people, and the church has helped imprison them. And that is an appalling injustice, I think, that has been done in the name of religion and faith. I think that Jesus affirmed protection, love, care, welfare in a day when if a man decided to chuck his woman out into the street, she would have had no job, no family, nothing, no one to care for her. She would have been excluded from the community. She probably would have been sent out of the city. And when Jesus condemns divorce, I think that's exactly what Jesus is condemning. Exactly. But I don't think that this should be a weapon to use to keep two people together who quite clearly hate each other and whose relationship is destroying their children. I think to do that and to use the Bible in that way is a complete and utter abuse. And I think we should be very careful how we handle these old Bible texts. Very careful indeed. Because I think Jesus was pro-love, pro-protection, pro-equality, pro-justice, pro-mutual care. So very quickly, so what? So what? What does the Bible say about relationships? I think what it's saying is that there is an equality between men and women. The Leviticus and Roman texts are talking about rape and abuse and manipulation and domination and power and humiliation and owning another person. And I think that God is probably as opposed to that now as he ever will be and ever was. It was a biblical culture that men were worth a lot and women were worthless. And I'm sorry, ladies, it's just that's how it was. It's not like that anymore, I hope. But I think the Bible passages are saying, do you know what? You cannot treat another person like property. You cannot take a person and put them into temple prostitution, male or female. It is a disgrace. You are taking away the humanity of that other person. And in a marriage, it should be equal, where both people are worth exactly the same, and one doesn't always have the power and one is always submissive, because that's an abuse. And I think that's what the Leviticus and the Romans things are teaching us. People are not property. They're equal. 1. 2. We talk about marriage very broadly, I guess. I think that marriage mirrors the love of Christ for his church. Marriage is a sacrament. In the Catholic Church, marriage is viewed as a sacrament. It's a visible sign of something inward, of an invisible grace. It's a living embodiment. It's the closest image that we have of love, fidelity, commitment, forgiveness, grace, and a covenant of two people promising to be together, which is what Jesus promises to his church and what God promises to his people. And I think that marriage is that. That's what it should be. It should mirror the love of God to us in our love for our partner. I don't think any of the biblical texts that we've looked at this morning are about that. They have nothing that bears any relevance to that. They are all about abuse. I don't think marriages should be abusive, and I don't think relationships should be abusive. And I read the texts, I think God is saying, this is wrong. But not because of the reason why I used to think it was wrong, but for something else. I had an email this week from someone, very helpful email, kind of got me pondering. It talked about John 8, woman caught in adultery. I think it's John 8, can't remember off the top of my head. Should know, don't. I know it's not John 10, I know it's not John 4, I think it's John 8. Woman caught in adultery, the people drag her out, said, we've caught her in adultery, let's stone her. And Jesus said, let the person who's without sin cast the first stone. And they all walked away because they all had done things wrong. And we've got to be very, very careful with this. Because for years, I think the church has been very, very keen to throw stones at all kinds of people. And Jesus says, actually, you can't. Because the things in Leviticus and Rome are sins. I'm not sure that homosexuality per se, as we see it now, is. I don't think it is. I don't think that's what it's talking about at all. But even if it is, and even if that's your view, can't throw stones because Jesus said you couldn't. You've got to treat with love, respect and dignity. Whatever. It's all you've got to do. It's not your problem. Do you know what? I'm so pleased to be straight. I really am. Because actually I know gay Christians. And I tell you what, it's hurt them. The response that they've had from their churches, the response that they've had from their families has been absolutely appalling. My friend Dwayne in Bournemouth told me a story about a church in America burnt down by another church. I mean, what is that all about? That's not a Christian. When our children were born, So natural. It's just so natural. Do you know what? My children, they could be gay or they could be straight. It would make no difference to me whatsoever. And I can say this, and I'm recording that, so if one of them is or both of them are, they can play me the tape in years to come. It would make no difference at all to me how I viewed them. Why? Because I think I'm trying to be a good father. Well, if I'm trying to be a good father and God is the best father, then do you know what? I don't think it's going to make any difference to him whatsoever. I do not think, are you gay or straight, will be one of the questions that he will ask when we finally meet him. Just don't. If it is, I've misread him. And if I've misread him, I'm in so much trouble that this morning is going to be the least of my problems. I just want to tell you this. I listened to a fantastic talk the other day by Gene Robinson. If you go on YouTube, listen to some Gene Robinson, Bishop Gene Robinson. I heard him at Greenbelt. He was awesome. He was just brilliant talking about inclusion in the church. One of our values as a church is being an inclusive church. I have a book in my office written by a man, I think it's called Stanley Grentz. And his book is called Welcoming but Not Affirming. That is the most offensive title, actually. Welcoming but not affirming. That's like saying, we welcome you as a sinner amongst us. It's completely offensive. It's completely offensive. It's like saying we like you, but only because Jesus does. We personally don't like you at all. But we're going to be nice to you because Jesus said we should. It's a nonsense. Either you are inclusive or you are not. That's the challenge for us. Now, when I listened to Gene Robinson the other day, he came up with this really good point. And he said, years ago, you used to have no people in wheelchairs in church because the church didn't have ramps outside. So people in wheelchairs couldn't get into the churches. And when he spoke to the people in the churches and said, why haven't you got any ramps? They said, it's because we haven't got any disabled people who come here. Now for me, as a church minister, I hate it when people say this, but if Adam and Steve walk in, or Adam and Eve, it makes no difference to me who they are. If they want to come and worship with me, I'm delighted. I don't care who they are. I don't really care what they get up to. If they come in and want to find a place of spirituality and connection with Jesus, I hope they'll come into us. And you know what? As far as I'm concerned, this morning is me saying, I don't know what you guys think as a church, but this is me saying metaphorically, as a church minister this morning, I want to install the ramps. Because actually, I would like it known by people that if they are gay or lesbian or bisexual or transgender, if they have any of these things going on, actually I want them to know that there is a place that they can come to and someone who will treat them with the kind of dignity and respect that they deserve. I hope you guys all feel the same. I'm not going to argue about it, but I will meet anyone for coffee and have a chat about it. If you want my dissertation, you need to text me or email me my brilliant work. It's 2007, I was quite conservative then. And you can look at this book, and I'm going to leave it on the music stand. This is Jeffrey John's book. You can look at it today. If you take it, Jesus will know. Shall we pray? Lord Jesus, I thank you that this is your house. We are your people and this is your house. And whatever we believe and whatever we think and whatever we say and whatever views we hold, Lord, may we always be like you, and may we always be Christ-like. May people who come in through that door see something of the love of Christ in us and in this place. Lord Jesus, I pray that this would be somewhere where people would find safety, where maybe if they felt rubbish about themselves, would be a place where they would come in and feel that they are of great and eternal worth. Lord, I believe